All right. Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I have with me again Charlie Grapski, and through the magic of technology, we have come back without even having left our seats from the previous show. It's amazing. Charlie, we had arrived at the point of ethical democracy, the ethics of democracy, that third dimension that makes your 3x2 chart, it adds a little life to it. And we were talking about parties. Are parties necessary?
Right, and that's a good place to pick up again. I just want to correct you. The second dimension was the ethical. The first dimension, we have a 3x2.
Yeah.
Who rules for what end? And that's where Aristotle left it. And then he said the next question you ask from there is how do you do it?
That was the second.
And he said mix all the forms of government. When the founders of this country came together, and if you read, and we'll talk very detailed about this in a second, Madison in particular, they specifically say we're not talking about the Aristotelian mixed form of government. We want a popular form of government. Okay, that third column, right? The who rules is all. But what we don't want is ochlocracy, mob rule.
Mob rule.
Which many people refer to as democracy and think they dislike democracy as a result. But the pure form of democracy...
Isn't that democracy in its purest sense?
It's what a democracy has a tendency to degrade into. It is not what democracy is. It is the corruption of it.
It's what it degrades into.
Right. It's like if you have an apple and it erodes, even that's a natural process, and it degrades, it's no longer an apple, although it once was. Right? But when you're talking about wanting to eat an apple, you want the good form of the apple, not the corrupted form. And so democracy has this tendency. And all forms of government have that. And that's what Madison and the founders as a generation understood from their classical education. So let's get back to the question. And I think the way to do this is Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln has a famous phrase. And he says that America is a democracy. It is the land where it is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that conveniently fits with the three dimensions: who rules, for what end, and how. So we have who rules, the people rule. For what end, for the common good and justice of the whole. Now, how do we do it? And this is where Madison picked up. Now, let me just introduce these two books. I believe every American should own a copy of these books and read them. This first one is the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers were written by primarily Alexander Hamilton and James Madison right when New York was considering ratification. And it looked like the Constitution may not be ratified. And so it is a theoretical as well as rhetorical attempt to convince people to adopt the Constitution. The second book is Madison's notes on the convention. And by reading these, you can really get to understand, it's difficult reading, it's dry, it's not fun, but it's well worth the effort. Now, where I'm going to take us now is to Federalist 10. It's about 4 pages long. Every American can read that. The other thing I would say is all of this is available on the Library of Congress's website. But we're going to look at Federalist 10 because Federalist 10 is the core to Madison's well-constructed union. To give you a synopsis, I'm going to say there's 2 parts to it. There's representation, which enables a large government, and then there's the separation of powers, which come later in the Federalist Papers 47 through 51. We're not going to get too much detail about that. But in the 10th Federalist, Madison starts off and he says, a well-constructed union, representation, enabling it to be large, with the separation of powers, will be a cure for the mortal disease of faction or party government, right? Where government is based upon self-interest of those who rule, and it's the rulers versus the ruled rather than the ruled are the rulers, which is democracy.
An antagonistic situation rather than a working together type of situation.
Now part of the confusion comes is political scientists didn't like what Madison wrote, and they thought he was incorrect, and they tried to manipulate him or change him. And one of the things they've said is that, well, faction didn't mean party. Parties are now necessary, and this is why I say the oligarchic term that I use for our form of government is also expressed by party government, which I think party governments always turn into oligarchies by definition. I'll get to that in the end. But Madison says something very clear. He says, by faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. In a nutshell, there's your justice and the common good is the end, there's the people rule, and here's the problem. When people rule for passionate, interested, emotional reasons rather than reason, which brings you to justice and the common good. And it's really a brilliant piece of legal theory. It's so simple to understand if you read it closely. I would say it's divided into three parts. The first is he says what the problem is. The problem that needs solution is the mortal disease of all forms of popular government is faction, breaking people up into groups and having them seek power for themselves.
Divide and conquer, if
Divide and conquer, yes, absolutely. Which is what we see in politics and practice today. The two parties attempt to divide and conquer. And then the next two parts of Madison's argument go through what he thinks are the two possible means of the cure. And the first is cause, and the second is effect. I mean, it's very, very, very well written, very simple. If we go for the cause of faction, there are two ways we could cure it. We could eliminate what's necessary for faction to exist, and that is liberty. Or we could have such a small and homogeneous community that nobody has different interests or passions, and that we all already agree. On that one, Madison said, well, that's simply impractical.
If not impossible.
It's well, it is impossible.
Even a family sitting around a dinner table is going to have a degree of disagreement.
Right. Well, reason is flawed. Mm-hmm. We're not perfect, even when we try to reason. And so even when you're using reason, you're going to come up with mistakes. Mm-hmm. So that's not the solution. And to get rid of liberty, of course, is a cure worse than the disease. So he concludes, he says, we can't solve this problem by going after the cause. Let's now look at the effect. Right? And he talks about the effects of faction. I mean, I'll read another quote from that in a second to show you the kind of things that he thought factions were doing to the country at the time, and which I think if you hear them, you say, well, wow, that sounds like today. So again, he says, if we want to go for the effect and negate the effect, there's two possible ways. Again, small homogeneous societies. Small homogeneous societies can share the same interests and passions, and you would hope therefore that they could live together as a democratic form of society. And this was the common view of democratic theory up until that time, that it had to be small and it had to be homogeneous. And Madison is arguing the exact opposite, because what you also have to remember at the time is when the Constitutional Convention was convened, one of the major arguments being made out there at the time was, let's divide America into three. The North Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South. They are different geographically, they're different in interests. Only they could have this kind of government. And Madison says, no, that's a mistake. Let's come up with a new way of looking at it. And he says, the best way to cure the disease of faction is by introducing the concept of representation. And by introducing the concept of representation, we achieve a number of things. Now we can have a large society and a diverse society with a multiplicity of interests, a multiplicity of views, so many and so diverse and so far away at a time when you didn't have automobiles and trains and planes, fax machines and the internet.
Many people never saw other parts of America.
iPhones and Blackberries. You couldn't coordinate as a faction to take power. And he said that it is America's ability to be a large nation that is going to be the key if we have representation as part of it, because it will enable no faction to gain a majority. And he actually says that there's two types of factions. Remember, you can have a minority faction or a majority faction. How do you solve the problem of minority faction? It's already resolved with what he refers to as the Republican principle. In that he means majority rule.
Right.
The minority can't make the decision, therefore that's solved with that part. But what if the faction happens to gain a majority, which is exactly what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party seek to do today. They want a majority, and when we get to a little bit of the separation of powers, they not only want a majority of the legislature, they want the president and Congress, and even now the judiciary. And this was tyranny to the founders. That was the thing to be feared absolutely the most, yet it's exactly what we have today. So Madison said...
Before you go on, I just want to ask you, I'm hearing that this is why we have a House of Representatives where there are a number of representatives in each state determined by population, and yet the smallest of states, the states with the least population, still in the Senate have the same number of votes as the largest states. Is this a separation that they were looking to achieve?
No, and we can't go too far down that because that would take us into a whole other discussion. Very important one, though. Madison was very much opposed to that. That's the Connecticut Compromise is how that's often referred to, by the way, by an accident that the person who proposed it was one of the delegates from Connecticut. But that was a compromise necessary to get the Constitution out of the convention and out to the public for ratification. And it was considered to be a danger because it made the Senate potentially the source of faction. Madison's fear of factions was actually, he wrote a pamphlet before the convention entitled The Vices of the American Form of Government. And he said it was these state factions that were killing the country, because you had certain states that had all these debts run up during the war and weren't paying them, and you had other states that were paying not only their share but everybody else's, those sorts of things.
For the common good.
And so having equality in the Senate meant that the Senate could be conceived of as representing states, and that was not supposed to be the case at all. But it was a necessary compromise to get it out. But I don't want to confuse too much with that, because ironically, one of the things that has saved us from total corruption has been the Senate, because the one thing that was there is the House of Representatives was supposed to be elected. It was supposed to be larger, therefore more representative, and it was supposed to be elected more periodically, 2 years. So therefore it was supposed to be closer to the people's views at the time.
Did we have 435 representatives when we were restricted to 13 colonies?
No, certainly not. No, there was less than 100, I believe, in the first Congress. I mean, it's proportional. Of course, we've now put a cap at the 435 is a cap that we've arbitrarily put on there. But the Senate, being a body that was elected for longer terms, was considered to be the one that would be more deliberative and less prone to the winds of factionalism, and as a check on that part of the House. So that's where those two come in. But let's sort of just stick with Federalist 10 for a second, because otherwise because there's so much we can talk about.
That's for another show.
Certainly. So just to recap, Madison uses a metaphor of fire. Again, when he says if we take away liberty, we get rid of faction. Problem solved. Fire is both destructive and productive. You get rid of fire, you get rid of all of the destructive properties of it. You solve it. So you get rid of air, and you get rid of fire, and you get rid of all the destructive properties of it. But you not only lose the productive properties, but you also lose the thing you want most, which is life. So air is to fire as liberty is to faction. Okay? And I'm going to come back to that metaphor toward the end again, because of what he hopes to achieve through representation. The representative medium, again, the people are supposed to be deliberating. There's supposed to be a discourse. One of the key things is that there's supposed to be a foundation of democracy in America at the local and state level. I mean, this is where the citizen is supposed to be the citizen legislator in your local government. And upon that foundation, you take these more distant governors who are representatives, who you hope through this process of diverse and large bodies electing them are going to generally produce people who are going to be reasonable people, who they can't outbid each other with numbers. They have to agree through reason. So they have to have a discourse. So this medium of discourse, the House of Representatives was supposed to be a place where debate took place all day long. There's no debates in the House of Representatives. The votes are already known before they get to the floor. The speeches are written in order to put it into the congressional record so they can say to their constituency, I said this, that, and the other thing.
So that's why there's no filibuster in the House.
Well, that's another history. The Senate has different rules. Being a smaller body, it was enabled to be much more flexible. The House becoming so large, they were trying. That's why they're. I mean, these are just choices that come later. This is not built into the plan. But the key is there would be a multiplicity of voices in the legislature, and that multiplicity of voices would only come to agreement when they could all agree that it was in the common interest and it was just and it was needed and it was in the general need of the country. It's not something that was particular to one state because it was supposed to be democratic from the ground up and doing it there. It wasn't supposed to be needed to enforce civil rights, to enforce equal rights, equal protection under the law. That was supposed to happen on its own. It was there to defend it. And of course we know that in the late 20th century it had to come in and do that. And this is where many of the concerns come of the federal or national government extending its powers, which often, if people read and understood this, I think that debate itself would become more clear. Again, a topic for a later discussion. But this process of deliberation, looking for what's in the common interest and the common good, without anybody, I mean, yeah, there are going to be parties, but there's going to be so many of them that they all have to work together on each issue and give reasons why that issue should be adopted. It's not about sitting in the back room and saying, "What, I'll give you this and you give me that." I mean, we know that the Republicans and the Democrats, once elected, I mean, pork barrel politics, the Democratic senators will give the Republican senators what they need for re-election, and the Republican senators will give the Democratic senators what they need for re-election.
To the exclusion of what America needs.
And that's factionalism. That is the definition Madison gives of factionalism, and it is what shuts down our government. Now, to jump one moment to that separation of powers side, because now you had such a big nation, and the representatives were distant eventually in Washington, D.C., how did you keep them from becoming a ruling class amongst themselves?
Where there's that distance between them and their voters.
Right. So how do you keep them from just taking power for themselves? That's where the separation comes in, and that's another discussion. But just to sort of briefly give a couple points on that. One of the points was most of the states had separation of powers, but it wasn't working. And Madison wrote in one of the Federalist Papers, 47 through 51 is where he deals with this. He writes, parchment barriers, the mere written constitution is not going to do it. We have to create an institutional dynamic that prevents those factional interests from uniting. So the legislature was supposed to have its interest, the executive was supposed to have its interest, the judiciary was supposed to have its interest, and they were supposed to check each other. And of course,
what
we know
call
now
checks and balances.
Party politics, particularly in a two-party system, which is what has emerged by accident initially, and it comes from primarily because we use winner-take-all elections. And there is a social science law, probably the only one that really is a law, called Duverger's law, that says if you have a winner-take-all election system with these single-member districts, there are going to be two dominant factions, one of which is going to win. And in time, all these other minor ones you're going to learn you join one of the other two if you're going to have any chance. So it brings you into this two-party system. And this is where we get to modern political science. Because in modern political science, they rejected the idea that parties were bad, but they also rejected the idea that democracy was possible. And they redefined democracy. Democracy was ruled by the people for the common good, and then, of course, Constitution was the solution of how in this case. The people became simply the institutional check instead of the separation of powers by being able to vote the existing government out of office, and that was their only function. They were not to deliberate. And the common good was considered to be metaphysical nonsense. You can't find it, you can't put it in a box, I mean, you can't locate it, so we can just take that out. And what you wind up is saying the goal is policy, and policy enactment efficiently and effectively. And so this constitutional mechanism is messy. It's ineffective. It's inefficient. It was meant to be. So parties, especially the two-party system, were meant to bridge the gap between the separation of powers. And of course, that's what we see. The president has become the leader of a party, and we look at divided government when the president and the Congress are in two different hands as bad, and we think it's supposed to be the other way around. And what people don't realize is this theory that this was built on, and this practice was built on, was really written in the mid-19th century in England, when England was going through its democratic sort of revolutionary moment.
So prior to our American Civil War by about 10 years.
Right around right during and after our Civil War.
Oh.
And that's why there was a lot of criticism that America was failing. And two key thinkers, a guy named Walter Bagehot, B-A-G-E-H-O-T, and a guy named John Stuart Mill, much more famous, wrote two books critical of the American system and arguing how do you have a better system. Bagehot's book was called The English Constitution. And what he argued for was, he says, the thing that's destroying America is the separation of powers. We need a fusion of powers with executive power in a cabinet. And Mill says, no, the problem is representation. The two-party mechanism in America is eliminating the best, the aristos, the elite, in the positive sense, the ones who had the ideas, the ones who cared, the ones who were honest. They're not getting in. Instead, we're getting the manipulators in. And so he argued change the electoral mechanism, another topic for a really good discussion at a later time. But you see, it was this representation, large and diverse, with discourse and no party dominance, and the separation of powers. And that was supposed to eliminate this mortal disease of factionalism. And he comes at the end of Federalist 10 and he says, look, the worst that can happen in this system is the influence of factious leaders, they'll exist, may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. So national parties are exactly what he's afraid of. Now, I did want to come back, and I did want to say, because I know we're about to conclude, and I want to give you a chance if you've got any questions. I'm talking too much, probably.
No. This has been a marvelous opportunity for me and for our audience to learn about a lot of very fascinating history.
I mentioned how all of our national constitution is founded on something that's not really written directly in any of it, because it is assumed, and that is that we are going to have locally based democratic government, that the people are going to be actively participating and therefore learning. And of course, this is where Aristotle's ethics comes back in, because the two-party system and that definition of politics, oh, by the way, political science defined politics as who gets what, when, and how.
What, when, and how?
Competition of interests, right? And how to effectively and efficiently get there. I define politics as the art of living together.
The common good rather than divide and conquer again.
Exactly. It's cooperation versus competition. It's not compromise, but putting together what's right for the whole. And if we don't take back our local governments as citizens, if we don't, and in New England, it's far better than in most other states, and particularly states where I live, like in Florida. But citizens have to participate to learn how to be citizens. And in that process, they learn each other, they become a community, they learn that they have common interests. I mean, probably 10% of our interests are those particular interests that divide us. 90% we agree on, yet our system is so corrupted, so dysfunctional, even if you take the unethical actors out of it, that we never get to that point.
Now, if that's not really, in fact, the crux of not just my philosophy personally, but all of the shows that we do on Progressive Soup is finding that common ground and recognizing the fact that we agree, all of us agree on, really, I think certainly 90% at least of everything, and then agreeing on those things, finding a common respect for one another, then finding those few odds and ends here and there that we disagree on, and finding a compromise on those matters.
Right. And let me conclude by saying this. Almost everybody in America complains about the two-party system. Almost everybody in America complains they don't have choices. Yet they tend to vote Republican or Democrat or don't vote, because that's all the choices they have.
And they think not voting is their third choice,
and
when in fact it's not.
Right, right. But also many people who are very strong saying, I believe in the Democratic Party, I believe in the Republican Party, and I don't want to get rid of them, have to realize that this system doesn't say you get rid of them. In fact, it would enable the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to be what it is. Because instead, they're always trying to just capture a little bit more of the other party to get a 51% majority, rather than actually having principles. And this is why you see politicians jump from one party to the other. This is why you see people running as a Democrat because 80% of their district is Democrat, yet they're a Republican, or vice versa. I mean, it is a functionally dysfunctional system, in large part because we have failed to appreciate and understand the arguments that particularly James Madison laid out in Federalist 10 and 47 through 51.
Okay, I want to take just the last minute, because I think it's not only necessary but a good idea to reiterate what we talked about in the first show. I'm going to read off Charlie Grapski's long and distinguished lists of achievement, and not just in the academic world, but things that he's put into actual practice as a citizen, as a citizen of the United States of America. His bona fides are a bachelor degree in microbiology from Auburn University, bachelor's degree in philosophy, history, and political science from University of Florida, master's in political science, University of Florida, master's in legal, political, and theory, University College of London, LLM, legal history, jurisprudence, University College of London, law teacher certificate, University College of London, doctoral candidate in Florida, and law doctorate candidate in University College of London. And this has been Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson, and we've had the pleasure of having Charlie Grapski, and enjoy your evening. Thanks very much.